Okay, so welcome everybody to the overview of the literature review by Dr. Scott Abella that was supported by Clark County of desert tortoise habitat restoration techniques. And Dr. Abella has done kind of a meta-analysis of work that's been done so far on habitat restoration, and he's made some really interesting conclusions about what has worked and what hasn't so far, different combinations of methods that can be used. And we really wanted to hold this session ahead of our desert tortoise habitat restoration workshop that's occurring on January 24th through 26th. It'll be virtual. Hopefully all of you have gotten the invitation to that workshop, but if you haven't and are interested in learning more about it, please feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat box. I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Julia Sittig. I'm from Southwest Decision Resources, which is a facilitation group that facilitates natural resource collaboration efforts throughout the Southwest. And then Colleen Whitaker is my colleague, and we are co-leading the Desert Tortoise Restoration Workshop. So we're very excited today to review and discuss what Dr. Abella has found in his literature review. We'll have some time for discussion. And if anybody has any questions as we go along, please put them into the chat box and we'll make sure that they're addressed as we go along in this hour. Before I turn it over to Stephanie, does anybody have any questions about this session or about the Desert Tortoise Habitat Restoration Workshop that's coming up? Okay, in that case, we will turn it over to Stephanie Ferrazzano from Clark County.
Thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. As Julia said, my name is Stephanie Ferrazzano. I'm a biologist with the Clark County Desert Conservation Program. And on behalf of Clark County, I'd like to just thank you all for participating in today's session. So briefly, I just wanted to mention that this session is kind of in preparation for the workshop, as Julia said. And during the workshop itself, we'll be focusing on two main questions, which are basically, what do we know and what do we need to learn more about when it comes to desert tortoise habitat restoration? So I just want to kind of plant those questions in our minds so that we have them to think about over today's session and the next few days leading up to the workshop. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Thank you once again for joining us, and let's turn it over to Scott.
All right, well, welcome everyone. And I'm going to do a screen share here to open up the document. Okay, hopefully that's showing up for everybody here. All right. The intention today is to provide essentially a guided skim to this fairly large document. And so we'll be going through the document itself with the goal of highlighting the major points, some of the major conclusions, and then also where you can find some of the information within this document. And I wanted to make it a little bit different here today than what will be at the initial presentation that they've asked me to give at the start of the kind of the overview presentation to the workshop on January 24th. That will be more of a PowerPoint format, kind of more of the highlights, kind of conference style, whereas today is more intended to be sort of the guided read and where do we find some of this information. So starting into the document here, just wanted to mention and actually just a really quick question. Do you know if there's a way to move the, let's see, there we go. Need to minimize that here. So just wanted to provide a little context here, just going through the summary really quick to provide an overview for today. So first, what are some of the contributions that habitat restoration can potentially make to desert tortoise conservation and recovery actions? And so first, we can use restoration as one of many tools to potentially reverse habitat degradation, replenish or enhance resources that are required by tortoises, and then also to limit further degradation. And that can be very, very important. And we'll show some examples throughout. And four of the main features that restoration can help address, along with other conservation actions, are in terms of good quality tortoise habitat, are ensuring that tortoises have adequate perennial cover plants, high quality native food plants, free water for drinking that the habitat needs to supply, and then also safety, which is kind of an overall category that might range widely from having soils that don't have toxicants in it that can be harmful to tortoises, to say not having road mortality, excessive road mortality, and not having excessive predation by common ravens, for example, along with many other potential factors as well. And so in terms of the review specifically for the restoration portion, I did cover over 50 published restoration studies thus far in the Mojave and Western Sonoran deserts. And this is the focus, which is the range of the listed Mojave desert tortoise population. And we'll, after going through some background on tortoise biology and habitat requirements, the bulk of the review will be covering 11 major restoration treatments and their variations that are in 3 different categories. And then in terms of the contents here, just first going through just a couple key points on some of the biology of desert tortoises and how that relates to restoration, including some of the habitat features, and then some of the indicators of habitat quality. And then, as mentioned, going through these 11 restoration treatments, include in the 3 categories, including active revegetation, such as seeding or planting, environmental site restoration, which can include factors like ameliorating disturbed soils, providing water and structure, and then restorative management actions, such as providing fencing to limit disturbance and reducing non-native plants. And then going into some of the finances and logistics, so cost estimates for some of the candidate restoration treatments, and anticipated effects of climate change and other changing factors, and research and adaptive management needs. And so one of the key points that makes tortoise conservation so difficult is that tortoises are facing what we perceive as a multi-factor set of stressors that can be very interactive. For example, tortoises, maybe they would be able to deal with droughts, but because we maybe maybe they're receiving pollution from maybe some nearby disturbed areas that's maybe weakened their immune systems, for example. Maybe they then don't have very high quality forage. All of these factors can interact and lessen the ability of tortoises to deal with natural stressors that they may have dealt with previously. So interacting stressors, and that also are occurring at a landscape scale. And so this is very different than some other conservation situations that we might face. Like, for example, if we have some rare plant species that occur at maybe a very limited number of sites, maybe if we can just protect those particular sites and do management at those sites, then those populations can be sustainable. It's a very different situation with tortoises, where many of these disturbances are landscape scale. And so one of the implications of this is that we'll have some examples of how we might optimize deploying restoration actions spatially to try and facilitate connectivity, for example, of tortoise habitats. And just want to mention too that deteriorating habitat conditions are not the only threat facing tortoises. For example, there's some genetic issues perhaps in some of the populations. And those are not items that we're going to be covering today. We're really going to be focusing on habitat restoration. And again, just wanted to emphasize that habitat restoration is potentially a very important tool, but is not the only tool, and it might be a management action that we can be taking in concert concert with other management actions, all aimed at recovering tortoise populations. And just want to highlight too, for a little bit more background, that the general principles of ecological restoration also apply here. Whether we're focusing on tortoises or for some other purpose, and broad variety of ecosystems, not just deserts. And that the general process is that we need to identify what are the sources of degradation, what are causing these problems. How then is our perception of high quality habitats or a reference condition, for example, not saying that we are necessarily aiming to restore to that directly, but rather just providing us with a template for what we consider to be good quality habitat. It's very hard to do restoration if we don't, if we're not able to isolate the causes of degradation so we can ameliorate them, and also at least having a range of conditions that we might want to aim for through our restoration actions. One example of that could be, for example, trying to understand what density of shrub cover would be high quality for tortoise habitat, and then how can we maybe emulate that in our restoration actions to provide tortoises what they need. And this note here, in terms of restoration, a lot of times we hear, well, is restoration really relevant in changing climatic conditions? And I guess I might respond to that and suggest that one could maybe argue that restoration is needed all the more now in a changing climate, in terms of trying to get these habitats in as good of condition as possible to enable them to best deal with some of these current and future stressors, such as droughts, changing climate, and so forth. And an example of that might be here. This is a picture from Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area in southern Nevada. And the left side is unburned habitat, and the right side is burned habitat that even 15 years after the burn still has very sparse shrub cover. And so if we're looking at this, and we're thinking about, well, Mojave Desert has been having a trend toward warmer and drier conditions, this habitat is maybe going to be particularly vulnerable to those warmer and drier conditions because there's so few shrubs that provide shade for not just tortoises. Tortoises need cover plants, but a wide variety of other animals. Plant diversity here is pretty low too. So there's not that redundancy in plant diversity where, for example, if there's a pollinator that might be mismatched because of, say, warming temperatures, when the pollinator might be active versus when the plant is flowering. So, we might take a look at this and say, one of the best strategies that we might be able to do as a adaptation strategy to climate change is to actually do restoration. And three overall contributions, perhaps, that ecological restoration can make to desert tortoise conservation efforts is, number one, enhancing existing habitat that maybe is in generally good condition, but that may be lacking certain features that tortoises could utilize. For example, maybe it has good shrub cover and is generally undisturbed, but might not have good quality annual forage plants, maybe because non-native plants are dominating the system. Second, we might be able to make degraded, currently largely unusable habitat more usable for tortoises while also improving habitat connectivity. And then third, we might be able to limit further degradation of tortoise habitat. And one example of that could be doing restoration at an entry point of a decommissioned road, for example, that might slow down or prevent altogether further damage than in the interiors of tortoise habitat. And just want to mention too that at times, perhaps even a do-nothing approach after disturbance might be most appropriate. Restoration can be expensive, it can be a lot of work, and it can take effort and resources away from other activities that could also be beneficial. So, again, really a first step is we need to identify the sources of degradation and whether or not natural recovery is possible. And maybe if we're getting recovery, then we might not want to deploy restoration. Unfortunately, so often in Mojave Desert ecosystems that are disturbed, especially severely, recovery is very, very slow. And one of the studies that we just completed in Southern Nevada examined recovery after 32 wildfires dating back to 1980. And we found that species composition typical of unburned shrublands, based on the very slow recovery trajectory thus far after about 30 years, was estimated to require 82 to 550 years to full recovery. Some other measures, like there was some recovery of plant cover, but the problem was it was typically a very small plants. So snakeweed and some other very small plants that really are not even as large necessarily as a tortoise shell. So they're not utilized very well by tortoises for cover plants. So getting that mature shrubland species composition back was estimated to be a very lengthy process. It's already been 3-4 decades and literally could require centuries. And so it's these types of situations that are where we have a system that's highly degraded and is not showing signs of recovery, that restoration might be able to proactively accelerate that recovery. And so just wanted to just quickly go through the goals of the actual literature review. And that's again, first summarizing tortoise habitat requirements that we'll get into in just a second. And then synthesizing the major restoration practices, providing estimated costs, and then anticipating future restoration and research needs. And so we'll systematically go through each of those sections. And I'll stop briefly at the end of each section too to see if folks have questions. And so just a couple really quick points from the overall Mojave Desert habitat that'll be themes throughout the talk today and the symposium is that first, this is a winter rainfall desert. And desert tortoises are mainly inhabiting the mid-elevation, the low to mid-elevation creosote bush, white burr sage communities. And with the being a winter rainfall desert, much of the activity is in spring when the annual plants are germinating. So that's when a lot of the food plants are available, temperatures are warming, and there can be moisture available. Unfortunately, as we'll talk about more, much of the annual plant composition in the Mojave Desert is now dominated by non-native plants, non-native grasses, and those very poor forage for desert tortoises. And so one of our restoration techniques is to try to restore native annual forage plants. And then another concept that's very important is this concept of fertile islands. And these are shaded, nutrient-enriched locations below the canopies of perennial plants, usually shrubs. And these are critical for tortoise cover plants. And then they also facilitate all kinds of other biological activity, such as facilitating the germination of annual plants, many of which are tortoise forage plants. And so one of our main goals in restoration initially is to restore these fertile islands, getting that shrub cover back that can also then help slow soil erosion and stabilize the sites as well. And just a couple of key points again. This is just a summary of some of the key points of desert tortoise biology. Many people know a lot more about this than I do. These are just some of the key points summarizing information that's highly relevant to habitat restoration, such as sizes of estimated home ranges, how far tortoises can travel. That can provide some indicators for us in terms of how big some of our restoration units might need to be, and connectivity considerations as well. And then in terms of the lifespan of tortoises, we know they can be quite long-lived. 50 years is not uncommon for maximum lifespans at times. And so one of the implications of this is that when we're looking at or monitoring restoration effectiveness, we might want to be thinking about at least two sets of indicators, maybe short-term indicators to evaluate how tortoises are responding, maybe in terms of shell growth, for example, or different measures of health that can be more reflective of more short-term conditions. And maybe that can provide us with some very good information on how tortoises may be responding to our restoration activities, because it might take much longer, perhaps decades, until we might see actual population changes and reproduction and so forth in the actual tortoise populations. And so next, going into just briefly some of the methods on how this review was put together. And so the tortoise habitat requirements approach used a narrative approach, just getting as many of the papers as we could that we were aware of. Went through over 350 publications dealing with desert tortoise biology to synthesize the impression from the literature from a whole diversity of perspectives on habitat requirements of tortoises. And then for the actual restoration papers specifically, conducted systematic searches through these databases using article titles and keywords listed here, as well as the resources listed here in this paragraph. And just want to provide an example here in table 1 of just some of the major reviews of desert tortoise ecology and then ecological restoration in Mojave Desert. Again, these are only examples. There's a whole bunch of other major reviews and papers as well, just trying to provide an impression for the literature that's available. Both in terms of desert tortoise ecology and restoration. And wanted to mention too that I've got PDFs of most of these, and I'm happy to share these as well as our own work that we'll cover through here as well, if folks would like to email me. So next, what actually constitutes high quality or perception of high quality habitat? And so we've had several different research approaches that have addressed this. First, utilization studies examining how tortoises utilize elements in their habitat relative to availability, such as cover plants, for example, or food plants. Correlational studies relating tortoise abundance with different habitat factors, condition factors. And then third, physiological studies, such as determining what temperatures are lethal to tortoises. And then that can tell us what shade resources, for example, would the habitat would have to provide for tortoises to be able to have protection from those lethal temperatures. And then some really good research, especially in the last couple years, on experiments that have started to relate responses of tortoises in terms of survival of juvenile tortoises and immune functions and so forth to experimental diets that have been fed to tortoises and other sort of those short-term manipulations, and then having the short-term indicators examined. And then fifth being some simulation approaches, trying to take all of this knowledge and simulate what types of habitats could support different tortoise populations over time. And figure 2 here shows what we might perceive as a fairly high quality tortoise habitat, at least on the surface, in terms of having some large cover plants that can provide shade that tortoises can construct burrows beneath. There's a pretty diverse annual plant community, including some perennials, some perennial forbs that can provide forage as well. Low cover of non-native plants, and that's again good. So our fire risk is generally pretty low, and those plants are pretty poor quality forage, especially the non-native grasses, and generally minimal disturbance here. We might not be able to see in here if there's common raven populations and so forth, but just superficially here, this might be an impression for pretty good quality habitat for tortoises. And again, providing those 4 features of good cover plants, high quality food plants, water to drink, and safety. And then just quickly going through each of these factors individually. So cover, again, being needed by tortoises for protective cover as they're, for example, moving during foraging activities, being able to seek refuge, shaded refuge during hot periods of the day. And then also tortoises tend to construct their burrows beneath the largest shrubs. And some of those examples here are creosote bush, catclaw acacia, would be another example. Generally, the largest shrubs that have the most room below which for tortoises to dig burrows beneath. And we've had several studies that have correlated low tortoise densities with low densities of shrubs. And in terms of food plants, an overwhelming number of, there hasn't been a huge number of papers on this, but the overwhelming conclusion thus far is that certain native annual forbs and certain perennial forbs appear to be critical in meeting tortoise habitat requirement needs. For example, desert dandelion, desert plantain, these are some of the forbs that are consistently selected by tortoises in both experiments and in natural observations of tortoise feeding, and that also seem to have good quality plant chemistry that's optimal for tortoises. And so these are potentially very important for the habitat to be able to provide and for us to restore. And then water can be a difficult resource for us to deal with in terms of restoration. But some things that we can do, for example, if we have a very compacted surface after a disturbance, for whatever reason, maybe there's some old campgrounds or something, we worked on some huge areas like that that just have a pretty uniform surface. And one problem with that is it's not rough anymore. So there's not any of those depressions to catch water after rainfall. And so we can actually maybe do some of those surface roughening treatments so that tortoises then have water catchments to drink out of. And safety, again, is a pretty broad term, but basically having a habitat that's as free as possible of factors that can cause tortoises injury, premature death, or reproductive failure. And so this might entail things like decommissioning unused or unneeded roads, and then doing restoration on them to try to defer further disturbance on those roads. And then along with that same idea is connectivity and optimizing restoration spatially, so that perhaps if there's two really good habitat patches for tortoises, to make it so that it's not dangerous for tortoises when they're traveling between those patches. So, you know, we might be looking at things like doing restoration in corridors. One example could be if we have, you know, say there's a burned area that has now separated and fragmented what otherwise would be good quality habitat. Maybe we would be well served by doing restoration of that burned area to reconnect that high quality habitat. And here's just a summary in table 2 of some of the home ranges of desert tortoises. Again, maybe just to give us an impression for the level of and the size of restoration that we would need to do just to maybe accommodate one or limited number of tortoises, and then be able to start extrapolating that out. And just getting into some of the context for desert habitat restoration, just wanted to mention that we've had some failures ourselves, you know, projects where we've had all plants die, even sometimes when we've done things very well. This is a pretty unforgiving environment here to do desert restoration. It's obviously one of the more difficult environments on Earth in which to do restoration. But that said, and hopefully this is pretty encouraging, when projects are well designed and are using good materials and and they're matched well to sites. There's been many examples now of at least partial successes of desert restoration projects, including in desert tortoise habitat. And one example is we, a couple years ago, had a project that was in Southern California, and we had 100% of our outplants that died because it was actually the driest 2-year period in the last 50 years. But fortunately, we had also included some abiotic restoration treatments that we'll talk about later, some vertical mulch treatments. And even though it was so dry, those structures there were able to very effectively slow down soil erosion and even stimulate some recovery of shrub seedlings, even during those dry conditions. So we had a 100% fail in our very expensive outplanting, but then quite a nice success in our much cheaper vertical mulching treatment. And so that really showed the value of sort of a bed hedging approach and applying 2 different treatments and enabling having some success, even though it was the driest period in the last 50 years. So again, hopefully that's pretty encouraging that these are things that we can, in fact, be successful at, even though it is pretty difficult. And just want to mention some of the challenges. Often there's limited availability of native perennial plant materials, low and erratic precipitation, of course, and hot desiccating summers. So timing when we're doing our activities is very important. And then often extreme levels of herbivory, given how little plant material is available for animals to eat in the desert, and also the fact that oftentimes our greenhouse grown plants are enriched in nutrients. And then getting into the major restoration treatments. So we'll go through a series of 11 major treatment types, again, in the 3 categories of revegetation, environmental site restoration, and restoration management actions. And this is a summary table of the number of studies that have been done. So we really do have a very nice database at this point. Certainly we have a lot more that we need to learn, but we at least have a pretty good baseline at this point on maybe what's seeming to work and what also then needs some more attention. So again, we'll go through revegetation and the variations to that, environmental site restoration, and then restoration management actions. And so a first active revegetation treatment is outplanting. And this is planting nursery propagated seedlings or cuttings at field sites. And one of the advantages of this is that we're investing a lot in each individual seed to try to get it to produce a seedling. So we don't need to do necessarily huge amounts of seed collection. We don't have to worry about the very risky germination and seedling establishment, which is very rare in desert field settings. And then we may not be able to necessarily cover huge amounts of area through outplanting. It's much more designed to be strategically applied. Be thinking like in terms of establishing patches, islands of revegetated plants in, say, a large burned area, or maybe just deploying it strategically, maybe at entry points of decommissioned roads to conceal that. And so we might be able to do a lot of good with maybe even just a couple hundred outplants, for example. And we also need to remember that while seeding might be able to be implemented over larger areas, if we don't get any seeds to establish through seeding, we've still covered 0 acres, right? So outplanting is generally viewed as perhaps more reliable than seeding, but seeding can also be a really important tool as well that we'll talk about. And this would be an example of an outplanting project. This is at Joshua Tree National Park, and really kind of an ideal setting for outplanting in that it was a series of small distributed disturbances, and they wanted to get pretty rapid plant cover. This is right after these plants were planted, and these sites have really revegetated very nicely since then. And it's showing here, these are cages to deter herbivory. And there's been very high survival in that project. And one of the purposes of outplanting for tortoise, remedying degraded tortoise habitat, is rapidly providing cover plants for tortoises, especially if we're focusing on some of the large perennial shrubs. But there's also been success with outplanting some of the cacti species and desert globe mallow. And these can be very important forage for tortoises, especially in dry years when there might not be very many annual plants. And there have been a total of 16 studies that have collectively assessed 46 species for at least 1 year. And we're starting to get an impression of which species have worked pretty well. And that's summarized here in the huge table. And we might then be able to design our projects with two things in mind. What are some of the species that have the greatest chance for success? And then which ones provide the desired functions for tortoises? And I just want to really quickly just mention some of the associated treatments with outplanting. Oftentimes there are supplemental treatments done to try to increase the survival of outplants. Clearly there needs to be cost benefit analyses done to ensure that that extra effort is worth the higher survival versus just planting more plants. But that said, treatments a lot of times are very critical to outplanting success. And it's summarized here in this table, in table 5. For example, with caging to deter herbivory, this is a ratio. And so it means that there were 4 times more plants surviving in this particular study that were caged versus not caged. And all of these are pluses here. So a lot of benefits with any types of protection, except for herbivore repellents, which didn't work in the one study in which they were tested. We might also then attempt different irrigations, and it might seem that irrigation would be kind of a no-brainer for increasing plant survival in a desert, but it's actually underperformed protection so far. So like these that are just 1.0, that means that survival was identical for irrigated and non-irrigated plants. A couple of them that it did provide benefits. So, not saying that irrigation doesn't work. There might be some benefits in some cases, but then we can also have challenges where maybe in some of these cases, it was not possible to get enough water out to sites. That's a particular issue if we're dealing in remote field sites. And this would be an example of a protected creosote seedling here on a burned area in southern Nevada. And this is a shelter, and it's already grown out of the shelter. And just within 3 years, it was already over 3 feet tall and was already flowering. And so what we would then do is go in and actually remove the shelter. And then it might take a year or a little bit of time for the lower branches to regrow. But the point is that we've actually gotten this plant to survive and even flower and begin reproducing. And so that's, again, another way that we can have outplanting potentially cover much larger areas than we're actually just initially treating. And then salvaging and transplanting plants can be similar, and this is often done in the context of if there's a planned disturbance, where we might be able to salvage plants from a donor site and then move them to a recipient site, or even move them back to that original site if it was a temporary disturbance. And so this, I'll show you an example here in a second from a road reconstruction project, but we might have temporary disturbances associated with renewable energy development and all kinds of other disturbances too, that we might be able to use this as a technique. And there have been a handful of studies in the Mojave Desert that evaluated this, and including 44 species, and pretty good performance in that 25 of those species have been able to achieve at least 50% survival. And again, many of these can be tortoise cover plants, and some of the perennial forbs can be food plants as well. And just want to show here an example of one of the projects that we were involved with in Lake Mead National Recreation Area, where we went out and salvaged. These are all salvage plants, and then cared for them for a year in this temporary nursery that was set up at a ranger station because it had a water source. And then we cared for these plants for a year, and then put them back out at field sites. And this would be an example here of some of the roadside sites. And this is desert tortoise habitat, again, with cages here to deter herbivory. And there's been very good success with this outplanting as well. And then cuttings is another treatment that we can go through here pretty quickly. And cuttings can use cuttings from stems, branches, rhizomes, or roots. And this is basically an old school technique taking advantage of the clonal reproduction traits of some plants. And it hugely significantly avoids a need to collect and successfully germinate seed. And one of the species that has done very well under this type of work are prickly pear cacti. And this is a cactus pad that was just cut from a donor plant. So we would just go out and just cut individual pads, not too many from any one plant, because we're, of course, not wanting to kill the donor plant, and then planting it. And it's already here within 2 years, already sending up flowers. And these are rock shelters that were also tested here as trying to see if creating these microsites enabled higher survival of these cuttings. And this was just a decimated site. There was almost no plant cover. This was an old mined area. So, we're just really trying to get just some initial plant cover started so that there's some resources, maybe drawing in pollinators and so forth, and providing some vegetative cover. And so cuttings was very effective for accomplishing that in this example. Seeding is also another revegetation treatment, and it's not fully reliable. There's been many examples, that's why it's noted here, of full total failures, and especially in recent times. There was a lot more successes in the 1970s, which was a pretty wet decade. But that said, it still seems like it has a lot of potential because people have moved on now to trying to identify associated treatments that can also perhaps increase the reliability and success of seeding, and also trying to focus on the species that do have the greatest chance for success. And again, here's a summary table of seeding. And I just want to draw your attention to just one example here, a project that involved pelletizing seed of the native annual forb desert plantain. And this was very significant because it very successfully augmented a priority forage plant for tortoises, tripled the cover of this annual forb through at least 2 growing seasons after seeding. And so this is a pretty big success in showing that we can, in fact, reestablish some of the annual forward priority forage plants for tortoises, and be very good to have this type of research with a whole diversity of other species so that tortoises can have that diverse menu, so to speak, of plants to forage on. And would just like to note here too that, as I was mentioning earlier with the project that was during the kind of the driest period in the last 50 years, one idea with seeding is to actually pair it with other treatments, including maybe outplanting. For example, there could be, say, if we're trying to revegetate a burned area, we might strategically deploy outplanting in small patches throughout the burn, and then maybe also do a seeding as well. And so it's a bet hedging approach in that maybe if we don't get seeds to establish either at all, or maybe it will take many years for there to be a sufficient rainfall year, we might be able to at least stimulate recovery in the meantime through outplanting. So, considering this as a bet hedging approach could be potentially a very useful strategy. And then assisted natural regeneration is another technique for revegetation. And this is designed to enhance the natural recruitment of species. And so it does not involve having to go out and collect seed and so forth. It's really trying to utilize on-site materials. And so one advantage of this is if we're dealing with natural plants at sites, they're already genetically native to the site. So that can be a huge advantage. And for example, many times we have years in the desert that have mass germination events for some of the perennial shrubs like creosote bush and burr sage. And there will literally just be carpets of seedlings of these species that germinate. And then oftentimes all of them or nearly all of them will actually die and not be present the following year. And so the idea would be, can we actually take some of these seedlings and do treatments to them to try to increase their survival and effectively basically promote natural regeneration on these sites? And we did one of these projects. This is a creosote seedling, and it was enclosed here in the shelter. And this is dry water with an irrigation. And then this is the seedling after a couple years with the shelter removed here. Did pretty good. Overall, though, the results are actually pretty equivocal on this project. So one of the main conclusions is that this really probably needs some further work, but has a high potential. And then I want to cover here some treatments in environmental site restoration. And one of the main treatments is vertical and horizontal mulch. And vertical mulch is basically planting dead plant material. And these are actually vertical mulches. And so these branches were gathered and actually planted here at this site to try to simulate a shrub, a creosote bush shrub. And so this can be helpful for slowing wind erosion, for example, starting to trap seeds, also providing some shade for germination of some of these plants, for example, and then also visually concealing disturbances. And again, can be an important bed hedging approach as well, in case our active revegetation treatments are not successful. And just want to mention too that there's been a couple studies that have shown that the vertical mulching can actually have in fact promoted some of the native annual forbs that tortoises forage upon. And topsoil salvage and replacement can be another environmental site restoration technique. And it's not necessarily always going to be feasible. It's kind of context dependent. Are there sites available to get donor soils from and salvage it? But when it is feasible to do, it's probably one of the most effective treatments that we have because it retains a lot of that soil organic matter, which we know can take centuries to accumulate in deserts, and retains all that seed matter and the soil biota as well. And this is an example of a salvage topsoil area that didn't get any planting. This area right in here, and it's already was showing very good recovery, probably just from seeds, either from adjacent areas or germinating from the soil itself. And so this would be an example of kind of a big investment up front, but that might save us a lot of effort later if we don't have to do seed collecting and care for plants. And then the rest of this section goes through some of the considerations for how to store the topsoil and so forth, given that there can be losses over time as it's stored. And then some of the microtopography treatments, as mentioned, one of the benefits of this potentially is to roughen soil surfaces so that there can be water catchments, both for plant seeds to be able to germinate and also for tortoises to be able to drink out of. And there's not been too many studies that have evaluated this, but some studies that have done these types of roughening treatments have found that they can majorly reduce soil erosion. For example, 91 to 99% reduction in dust generation. And this can be hugely important, not just for habitat quality and retaining all that soil matter, but also for air quality as well, given that we know that this dust is not very good either for human health as well. And these would just be some examples of imprinting here, and then this would be a ripping treatment to roughen the surface of a road to stimulate plant regeneration. And then restoring some of the key soil features of desert tortoise habitats, including biocrusts, which are superficial layers of bacteria and other organisms, desert pavements, and desert varnish. And there's been an increasingly amount of biocrust restoration studies looking at a wide variety of cultivation techniques for them and how to salvage them. A couple studies in the Mojave Desert that have found some success at salvaging biocrust material and reapplying it, and then getting that to begin to expand. For example, one study finding that applying salvaged biocrust material ended up recovering 43% of the cyanobacteria density found on undisturbed soils. And so this can be very important for limiting erosion, getting rejuvenating soil nutrient cycling and so forth, so that we can actually get plant establishment, again, for tortoise forage and cover plants as well. Desert pavement is not well developed in terms of these techniques, similar to desert varnish as well, but we do have some potentially innovative techniques. This is an example here of a disturbed area that received no treatment, and then this area here received some raking treatments to try to get some of the pavement rocks to begin interlocking, and then also received artificial desert varnish in addition to outplanting of creosote. And so it's already blended pretty well into the surrounding. This is undisturbed up here. So this is already looking pretty good. And the desert varnish might have some other functions too, in terms of retaining heat and maybe having a longer growing season for plants as well. And then just covering a couple of the restorative management actions here. Fencing has been shown to potentially provide great benefits to tortoises. One study at the Desert Tortoise Research Natural Area found that tortoise population densities were 2.5 times greater inside the fenced area after 34 years. And so this could potentially be an actual population increase that can be attributed to this management action. And this can be important both to protect tortoises from disturbance factors, but also there is competition for some of the same forage plants between tortoises and wild burros, for example, where burros also eat some of the same forbs that tortoises prefer. And non-native plant treatments is another one. And this is maybe one of the most important treatments that we can be looking at to try to reduce non-native plants. Because in the few examples where this has been done, we have seen positive responses in native annuals. And so in addition to protecting sites from wildfire, from all these fuels that the non-native plants are providing, which in turn then could remove cover plants for tortoises also if we have burned areas, and we showed how long that those can take to recover. If we can develop treatments and minimize the non-target unintended effects of those treatments to reduce non-native plants, this is potentially one of the most important strategic treatments that we could be doing to conserve tortoise habitats. I just want to really quickly just point out here one of the summary tables here of costs of restoration here in table 10. And it ranges widely from very expensive projects here that's essentially like attempted full reconstruction to projects that are much cheaper, $1,000 or so per 2.5 acres. And we might also envision even cheaper projects, for example, that maybe would be reliant mostly on abiotic treatment so that we're not having to collect seed and so forth, and that might have a lot of the work done by volunteers, for example. And so again, there's examples in here for you of some of these costs for these other treatments. And just again, just wanting to mention in terms of some of the changing habitat factors and how restoration might be all the more relevant here in changing climates, such as these examples, tying it back to tortoise physiology, where having that really good shrub cover with shaded conditions and so forth, and good quality forage plants, water available, might be all the more important if we're having warmer and drier climates. And so maybe looking at how we can better merge restoration with these changing environments and tailor treatments to those changes is probably an important research need. And then that gets us to some of the research and adaptive management needs. And this wouldn't be an exhaustive list, of course, but we might, again, envision that we really need to keep doing these. I don't want to call them basic studies because kind of each study has unique considerations and implementation, but continuing these types of outplanting studies and seeding studies, for example, so that we can really continue to provide managers with species that can work and treatments that can work at different cost levels that are available and at different sites. And we have to keep reminding ourselves too that research perhaps that was done in the 1970s, 1980s, maybe species that did well then, that's not necessarily species that are going to necessarily be maybe our priority ones for today in terms of their performance. So continuing to update this research is probably going to be very important for us. How do we deploy restoration resources spatially is another very important topic. And then, as mentioned, reducing non-native annual grasses. And then number 4 and number 5 are also probably very important in that we have these very good research studies that have linked tortoise habitat conditions with some of what we might expect in terms of tortoise health and populations. But we need to then take the next step and ask that question of, if we actually do restoration, then if we actually are replacing some of these factors to disturb sites, are we actually going to potentially see responses in tortoises? And we've had very few examples of that so far. And it really seems like now is a prime time where we're really at that point now where we can start integrating this knowledge and maybe even doing something like number 5, where maybe we could actually have some test landscapes and do as many restoration treatments as we feel are necessary. So going out, treating non-native plants, restoring cover plants, having good quality food plants, and then maybe doing other mitigation measures too, such as for common ravens, and really trying to see if we can show measurable improvements in short-term and long-term indicators in tortoise populations. And with that, we'd like to again thank Clark County and our planning group for all their support and pulling this together. And I know it's right here about 2 o'clock, but if folks would like to stick around, I'm happy to answer any questions. And then, also just as a reminder, I'll be giving a PowerPoint version as well, and having a lot of time for interaction too at the official workshop starting January 24th. So with that, thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. So much information packed into that literature review, and I know there's a lot more details that we can look at as far as, plant species, individual studies that have been effective, etc. Does anybody have some questions right off the bat for Scott?
I do, if I can.
Go for it.
Kurt Buellman. Hey, back in the very beginning, Brian Todd showed you some of our Head Start tortoises. And I think as a group, Brian and Tracy and I and our students are really good at growing tortoises, but I don't know how to grow tortoise food. All right. And this last year, we were doing really good until this drought. Okay. And then tortoises didn't have anything to eat. And those that did come out looking for food were eaten by coyotes. You mentioned some stuff about seeding. If we have really good habitat, like I'm not worried about the structure. The shrub structure is great. I'm worried about the food, annual forbs and stuff. If you had to define habitat and you could just say, what's the simplest, maybe most successful way to seed, or I know from your papers you talk about pelleted seed, but I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. What might you recommend if I wanted to get plantain, dandelion, and globe mallows back into the system, basically?
That's such a good question, and that reminds me too to mention, just like you said, this is a maybe great ground for collaborations between tortoise ecologists and plant ecologists, because like our lab and myself, we don't have permits to handle tortoises. We don't have the expertise. That's your wheelhouse, but we do know the plants. And so the pelleting seems to sometimes be friend and foe. It worked for the desert plantain, but then for the other three species that we tried in that study, like globe mallow and some others, it seemed to even maybe harm emergence. And so it could be things like size of the seed and how much energy the seed has to penetrate that seed coat, whether it's actually beneficial or a hindrance. So, and this probably seems very simple, but one really nice experiment that could be done potentially is just to pellet a whole bunch of the annual plant seeds and try it out, and see which ones that works. Because to be honest, we were very pleasantly surprised that plantain did so well in that study, including in, like you mentioned, in pretty dry conditions during our study years. Some other things that I think you've looked at as well too is maybe some strategic irrigations, perhaps also some treatments for non-native grasses, like just having, maybe below some of the shrubs, just treating some of these non-native grasses that are just choking out, some of these native annual forbs, and seeing what happens. And I didn't mention during the talk, but that could be very important for, maybe there are some years that are climatically marginal. And maybe before, some of the native forbs that tortoises could utilize would have germinated, but now all that moisture is being usurped by the non-native grasses. And so if we treat those non-native grasses, maybe it's possible that we could have more years that actually produce forage plants that are desirable for tortoises. So those are just a couple ideas. And I fully support your thinking and the idea of doing more of this type of research, because it seems like having these treatments that could accomplish this, which we really don't now, could at least provide maybe managers with some ideas on what might be feasible. And so, great question.
Right. I'll let some other folks ask questions too, but go ahead.
Hi, Scott, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
My name is Ellie. I am the preserve manager with the Desert Tortoise Preserve Committee, and we manage the Desert Tortoise Natural Research Area. So that was exciting to see you cite one of Dr. Berry's papers, and we need to do more research on our beautiful, pristine land that we have. But I wanted to ask you about one of the treatments in one of these studies. So I'm looking at page 22 of this very comprehensive PDF, and thank you for putting all this together for us. But I wanted to ask back with, I think it was an outplanting study, but they had several treatments starting with the protection in the cage. But then you go down to nutrient enhancement, and I see two treatments, fertilization and fertile island. Do you know what the fertile island treatment was, like how that was carried out and what that did as far as outplanting is concerned?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So they did different manipulations to shrubs. So they did things like, and this was kind of a research experiment. So some of these treatments might not be what managers would necessarily do, but they were trying to, kind of untangle these different factors. So
Yeah.
A few of the treatments, they would actually cut down a shrub and then plant on that fertile soil. And so they were trying to see like what's more important, like is it the actual fertile soils that are nutrient enriched, or is it the shade, or is it maybe both? So like, again, one of the treatments was they would actually cut the shrubs and just plant in the soil. And then one of the other treatments was, I think that they just had an open area that didn't have the fertile soils. And then they would actually plant kind of like a vertical mulch where they would just plant the the shrubbery, cut off a shrubbery and then actually just plant it there and, try to provide shade. So those are some of the things that, that they were looking at. They were kind of trying to simulate that natural process where the fertile island locations might be really important for not just annual plant regeneration, but perennial plants too, in that it might be cyclical. Like if there's the main shrub dies, maybe then another shrub seedling will sort of utilize that fertile soil to initiate the next shrub, either of that same species or a different species. So those are the types of manipulations that they were doing. It was a really neat experiment.
Yeah, I want to go back and read that study specifically. But yeah, that's, Dr. Berry has heard of fertile islands, but I'm new to desert ecology and desert tortoise conservation. So I had never heard of the fertile island phenomenon, but that's really interesting as far as if that is promising, if that means that outplanting in those locations underneath the creosote bush could ensure that your outplanting is more successful, or just understanding that there are natural hotspots you can take advantage of, especially in a pristine creosote bush community like our DTRNA. So that's something very exciting that we could potentially increase and guarantee our forage foods for our torts. So very cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
I could just follow up on what Ellie asked. You mentioned the fertile islands, which was in my mind too, but are there certain shrubs that make better fertile islands than others? I mean, in great habitat, we got creosote bush, but might we plant under pencil cactus or under ratani or this question?
Yeah, that is such a good question. It seems like some of the like overall, most of the shrubs do have some kind of increase in annual plants and soil below them, but it seems like there is a lot of variation in these different shrub species that appears kind of cultivate, in quotes, a different annual plant community. And so I totally agree with you. That could be a very important part of the diversity, especially if we're getting these different shrub species then that are having different annual communities below them. That really could be important for, again, that palette of foods for desert tortoises. And so there have been a couple papers on that, some like from the 1940s, even from Joshua Tree, that were some really good studies documenting the different annuals below different shrub species. And then we've tried to do some of that same type of work, kind of rejuvenate that, here in the last several years. And, we've been finding some of the same things that some of the annual plants, some of the shrubs seem to be associated with particular annual plants, and trying to figure out why that might be would be a whole nother set of questions. Of course, like, is it the nutrients or different lighting that can pass through the different shrub canopies, or even maybe different wildlife then that can't get in to the different shrubs to actually eat some of those annual plants as well. So I'm sure we could envision some really
cool. I'll look forward to talking with you more at some point about that, for sure.
Very good.
I think Carrie has a question or comment as well.
Hey, thanks a bunch for this great presentation, Scott. I work down in Palm Springs for the Fish and Wildlife Office, and I play with those pesky ravens a lot you were talking about. But I like to think about these desert restoration projects like you were presenting here. And I'm wondering if there's been any work, or if there's any tangible way to get a little bit of a foothold into getting the inverts to help us out on restoring certain sites. Are there certain ant colonies that we could move within a disturbed site to move the seeds for us? And just any thought you have on that. Sorry for kind of off the wall question, but something that I've always thought about.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not aware of any studies like that. Those would be super good studies to do. And that seems to me like a really good idea, because, we, in other habitats, as you might be aware, there's examples of like making artificial cavities in trees, like in forests, to try to enable then birds to show up at restoration sites. And as the birds are showing up and utilizing the artificial cavities, then they might be distributing seeds. And so, to maybe look at doing that in deserts could potentially be really interesting. And from some of these burned areas, if we look at like a species like blackbrush, a shrub species, its seeds are pretty big and it's moved by small mammals. But those small mammals don't like to be hanging out in open areas. So if we have a burned area that's 10 miles wide, we can ask, like, how is the blackbrush seed like ever going to get into the center of that burn, because it's small mammal dispersed and the small mammals are averse to even utilizing and going that far into the habitat. So kind of just like you're saying, if we can maybe develop strategies for species like that, and other species maybe that are more wind dispersed or have pollinators that are able to move, that really could be a new frontier in desert restoration.
Okay, great. Lots of discussion to be had, and I'm excited that we're going to have a whole workshop on this coming up. If anybody has any discussion topics that they're interested in discussing more about, or questions that were stoked by Dr. Abella's presentation today, please put them in the chat, and we'll think about how we can incorporate them into discussions at the workshop. Any other questions or comments before we wrap it up? All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Thank you so much, Dr. Abella, for this excellent literature review, and we look forward to further discussions on this.
Thank you.